The autothrust modes are automatically linked to autopilot flight director vertical modes. When autopilot flight director vertical mode controls a trajectory, e.g. altitude hold, vertical speed, glide slope, the autothrust is in speed mode. When autopilot flight director vertical mode adjusts the aircraft pitch in order to keep a target speed or Mach, e.g. climb, descent, the autothrust is in thrust mode. The main autothrust controls available for the pilots are the thrust levers. On the Airbus fly-by-wire family, the autothrust does not back-drive the thrust levers while it adjusts the thrust. Let's have a closer look at them.
When the autothrust is off, the crew controls the thrust, as usual, by moving the thrust levers over a quadrant. For forward thrust, this quadrant carries 4 physical detents or stops, which are idle, climb for max climb thrust, flex MCT for flex thrust at takeoff or max continuous thrust, toga for max takeoff or go around thrust.
The autothrust can only work when the thrust levers are set forward of the idle detent and up to the climb detent, or MCT detent in case of engine failure. If the thrust levers are set by the pilot in the reverse position, the autothrust cannot operate. Note, the alpha floor function is an exception which will be covered later on. When autothrust is on, the thrust lever position determines the maximum thrust which can be commanded by the autothrust, for example, to accelerate in speed mode. On the thrust gauge, which we will be talking about in the engine chapter, the thrust lever position is indicated by a symbol. It materializes the maximum thrust available for the autothrust in a normal operation. The autothrust has 3 states. It can be either disconnected or off, armed, ready to be set to on by a specific pilot action on the thrust levers, active or on. Let's see these states in more detail. We are taxiing to the runway. Because we are on the ground, the autothrust is necessarily disconnected. This is confirmed by the absence of any autothrust-related indications on the FMA and by the extinguished autothrust push button on the FCU. Thrust is manually adjusted by the crew, as required to taxi the aircraft. You are cleared for takeoff. The pilot flying must manually set the thrust levers to flex or toga to initiate the takeoff roll. Click on the thrust levers to initiate the takeoff roll. As soon as the thrust levers are set in the toga position, the FMA shows autothrust blue, indicating that autothrust is armed, manual toga white, indicating that the pilot manually controls the thrust via the thrust levers set in toga. Note, toga is the maximum thrust available for takeoff. At the same time, on the FCU, the autothrust push-button light illuminates in green. The fact that the autothrust is armed means that it is ready to be engaged by a pilot action on the thrust levers. Note that when the autothrust is armed, the pilot has manual control on the thrust with the thrust levers.
Crossing the thrust reduction altitude, thrust red altitude, the pilot must manually set the thrust levers to climb detente. On the FM, a flashing lever climb prompts the pilot to set the thrust levers back into climb detente. We will set climb thrust for you.
Notice that on the FMA, autothrust white indicates that the autothrust is on. Thrust climb green indicates that the autothrust is in thrust mode. Since the thrust levers are set to climb and the autopilot commands a climb mode, the autothrust commands thrust climb. The white boxes around the modes highlight the fact that a mode change has occurred on the FMA. Note, the Autopilot 1 vertical mode adjusts the pitch to maintain the takeoff scheduled target speed. In normal operation, when autothrust is on, the levers are left in the climb detent throughout the flight until the flare. The autothrust adjusts the thrust as required between idle and max climb, but the thrust levers, not being back-driven by the autothrust, remain in the climb detent as set by the pilots. Crossing the acceleration altitude, AC-alt, the FM climb phase is initiated. The autothrust maintains climb thrust, while the vertical mode, climb, adjusts the pitch to accelerate the aircraft towards the new speed target. The initial climb speed here is 250 knots. If at any moment the pilot needs some additional thrust, he will push the thrust levers forward from climb detent. He will then manually control the thrust. In that case, manual thrust is displayed in white on the FMA. Autothrust is displayed in blue, since the autothrust is armed.
Whenever the pilot brings the thrust levers back into climb detente, the autothrust is automatically back on, in the applicable mode. Note that the autothrust may be on, in flight, provided the thrust levers are set above idle to climb detente, all engines operating, or above idle to MCT, one engine inoperative. Beyond these detents, the pilot has manual control on the thrust.
When the aircraft reaches the target altitude, Autopilot Flight Director switches to altitude mode. The autothrust switches to speed, Mach mode, as indicated on the FMA. In this mode, the autothrust continuously adjusts the thrust to maintain the target speed, Mach. Autothrust is also in speed mode when Autopilot Flight Director vertical modes are vertical speed or flight path angle, GS, and generally during the approach. We are now in approach, just before flare. You fly the aircraft manually with the autothrust engaged. Note that the autothrust is in speed mode. During a hand-flown flare, the pilot has to reduce the thrust for landing. He will do so by bringing the thrust levers back to idle at about 20 feet. Note, if he does not do so, the autothrust will increase thrust to maintain the speed. A retard auto call-out comes up at about 20 feet as a reminder to retard the thrust levers. Click on the thrust. Thrust levers are now set to idle. This turns the autothrust off. Note that on the FMA, the white autothrust indication is no longer displayed. The FMA autothrust column is blank. On the FCU, the autothrust push button is now extinguished. We have just seen how to turn the autothrust off by setting the thrust levers back to idle for landing. The recommended procedure to set the autothrust off in flight in order to avoid any thrust change at autothrust disconnection is 1. To move the thrust levers back so that the thrust lever position symbol roughly matches the present N1 or EPR. 2. To press the instinctive disconnect push button located on the thrust levers. Note: pressing at least one push button for more than 15 seconds will inhibit the autothrust, including alpha floor protection, for the remainder of the flight. When the autothrust is off during flight, in order to turn it on again, press the autothrust push button on the FCU, with the thrust levers in or below climb detent. Note: you can disconnect the autothrust by pressing the autothrust push button on the FCU. This is not the standard recommended procedure.